We brought Perrin on today to talk about CrossFit teens because it's pretty cool. It's continued to grow, and we were just talking before we got on camera about the teens that we've worked with and some that have become games level teens. So we work with some that have won the games, and it started as just like all of CrossFit, where there are only a select few that were competitive. Kind of everyone else was off to the side, and now there are so many talented teens that are in this like pool of athletes that are trying to compete for the games.
What year did the teens join the games?
2015, and then I think 2016 is actually when Alexis qualified, which you were asking me about funny stories. I'm not going to tell it because I'll butcher it, but you should ask her about that
you
story.
You can't do that.
Well, because I'm gonna mess up the details.
Give us a tease.
But basically, she didn't really check her email because do teenagers really use email that much? No, especially 2016. And she didn't realize that she made the games and got an invitation, and they almost revoked it because she like passed the deadline. And someone was like, "Hey, you qualified." She's like, "What?" Went into her email box and like got back to them in time, but she almost didn't compete at the games because she didn't check her email.
I have never heard that story.
Yeah.
How do you know your sport's young?
Yeah, exactly. You talk about that, and so Lydia, one of our younger on-site athletes, she's going to do something for us, and I was like, "Can you log this on your computer?" And she's like, "I don't have a computer." I'm like, "Who doesn't have a computer these days?" But I guess when you're young, maybe you don't need one.
I can't imagine, but I feel like teenagers still don't use email that much, and sometimes I'm like, do I need to put your parents on this?
They use this now.
Yeah.
Everyone has the phone, and they're attached. It's attached to their hip, their head, earphones in, just like we were talking about.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, why would they need email? Unless you're working, why do you need email?
That is true. Well,
all you need to email for is to open up accounts for other shit that you know.
You're not wrong. And, I think email, all of social media really has become so dangerous because, like, think about the way that most of us start our days. We open up our inbox, and then it's like we are the slave to whatever is in there, and it's just constantly answering everyone else's tasks as opposed to, like, figuring out what we need to do for the day.
Speak for yourself, dude. That's not how I start my day.
That is how I start mine every single day.
Same.
Doing the Lord's work, though.
So what I wanted to get Perrin on here for is to talk about that process. I know that you're super passionate about teens, and I think that you have a really strong background in how to develop young teens into high-level athletes, but also keeping them safe along the way. One of the thing that scares me most about the sport of CrossFit in general is people jumping into it without solid guidance and then burning out in a couple of years. And this happens, and we can get there at some point, in all sports, right? Like if you specialize in a sport, you see a lot of people really talented, they fall off. But it worries me in CrossFit because the volume can become so high and the excitement is so high that that drive is always there to do a little bit more, to go a little bit harder. And then 3 or 4 years into it, you're 18 and your knees hurt and your elbows hurt and you have to back away from the sport that you love. So I would start there with you. How do you take an athlete that says they want to make the games or they just want to be a competitive teen athlete and kind of paint the picture for them of like, here's the road that we need to go on to get you to those goals?
Yeah. I think the assessment process is honestly the same as an adult, but there's just more factors because you're dealing with somebody who is developing, evolving, especially depending on what age. Their bodies are changing. They have
hugely
different stresses. Yeah. But I feel like the competitive teenage division, it's almost where the competitive adult division was as the sport was developing more, where it's like your weekend warriors and people with jobs and kids could actually make it to regionals or semifinals of the games and be pretty successful because the competitive landscape wasn't as competitive. And I would still kind of argue that's the case for teens. Like there's just not as many, but I can see that's growing tremendously as more money comes into the sport, more attention. So it's almost feasible, not necessarily to make the games, but be a fairly competitive teen, which also is hard, I think, sometimes if you're now this year, Wadapalooza, for instance, used to be attainable, and now they're taking top 10,
right,
16 to 18, so the division's even changing where it's like a 16-year-old competing against an 18-year-old.
It's a huge difference.
Huge difference. But I think the assessment process is the same, trying to understand where they are now by asking them questions, which can also be tricky sometimes because having a verbal conversation with a teenager can be just different to navigate. But where are they on paper? Like, what are the stats look like? What kind of experience do they have? Have they actually competed? A lot of them don't have a lot of competitive experience. So a local comp, maybe they made Wadapalooza, or it's just the open and quarterfinals. And then where are they in their development? So most of the teens I've worked with actually had athletic background, so gymnastics, swimming, running. So you can actually take and leverage and highlight those strengths from their athletic background and say, hey, you're really enduring. You have good pulling endurance, but you haven't really sat on a barbell for a long time. So where you are right now, if you want to be competitive in the sport, you really need to up your strength. So maybe we should focus on that a little bit more. But if you want to be competitive in CrossFit, you also need to develop all these other skills. So as the sport continues to add movements and change, obviously, what they're measuring, it can be really difficult. But teenage divisions, I think the programming is actually usually a little more simple.
Yeah. We'll get to the programming side in a second, but let's start with the assessment side. So I know that you said that it will be similar to what you would do with, let's just say, a high-level athlete that comes to you that's 24, 25 years old. But what is that process for you? A 16-year-old comes to you, let's say they have a gymnastics background, it's a female, she wants to be competitive at the CrossFit Games, and she says, do whatever you do, Perrin. What are you starting with?
So if they've done a competition before, the open, quarterfinals, a competition that has public either programming and they have the results, I look at that stuff right away. Like, how did you do in competition? Where were you exposed? If it's blatantly obvious, it's a strength deficit, you just start with the basics. I don't think you need to go into the granularity of like every single snatch variation, Olympic weightlifting variation, but do they need to get better at snatching, clean and jerking, squatting, deadlifting, pressing? And you can really start from there and just build a good foundation of a pretty basic, progressive, periodized strength program. And they will get better, faster, really, really quick.
Yeah.
But that can be hard sometimes, too, if it's going to take away from other things. So I find it's just a constant conversation of like, hey, what do you want to achieve? What's your timeline to achieve? What are our 3, 6, 12-month goals? Because if they do have a competition coming up, you want them to do well. You need to prepare them for that. But like long-term progress, I think for a teen who has a little bit more perspective on where they want to go, you can make a huge difference in a fairly short period of time, but they can't get pulled into the allure of like, I need to be ready for the open and quarterfinals this year.
Yeah. That's a fault of even the 45-year-old. Everyone wants instant success and gratification, but the reality is sometimes, especially in a training sport like this, it takes time. Absolutely. It takes time to acquire the skills and the strength needed or the conditioning needed to be able to support your systems in something like the open or quarterfinals. Let's go back to the assessment side. If you're telling a teen athlete, like those that are watching that maybe want to be competitive, just qualify for the next stage or do a local competition, what are the things that the teen athlete should be looking at in their own quote-unquote game? What are the tools that they need in their toolbox right away?
Yeah. The tests are definitely a little bit different. And I think, say they're shooting for something like a Wadapalooza, if that's your specific goal, go back and look at the programming of the qualifier, right? It doesn't really matter how well you do in competition if you can't qualify.
Right.
So typically the weights are a lot less. So similar to kind of when we talk about with masters, maybe you have to do a lot of 25-pound devil's presses fast for a female instead of 35 pounds and not really get wrapped up in like, can I RX everything for quarterfinals? So just looking at the tests you need to prepare for, like I said, identifying where are their holes.
Speaking of holes, real quick, I want to ask both of y'all, on that note, for the average of all the teens y'all have ever coached, what's been the most common hole for teens specifically?
Strength.
Yeah. I think that's probably the most common hole for everyone that comes into the sport. There are some guys and girls that maybe are outliers, but in general, most people that start the sport are relatively weak.
I agree. Yeah. And this sport is hard, right? Because it changes. Like there are standardized movements, but the standards change, the programming changes, the bias. So it's you're trying to hit a target that's moving and morphing all the time. And that conversation too can be really hard for people where it's like, hey, we're going to work on the strength progression and you're going to get a lot better. And then something comes out where it actually had a lot of your former strengths in it, but we haven't worked on them that much. And they just got super exposed and like, I'm getting worse. So yeah, I mean, I think strength and not rushing that process. So you've seen a lot of male and female, but I feel like I see it more with males, them trying to push the strength because they're aware they're not strong, a lot of back issues or a lot of knee issues. And like, you're 16, 17 years old, like to your point that you said earlier, do you want to be able to do this even in 3, 5 years, 10 years, or be able to walk around with your kids when you are an adult? That conversation, I think, is very hard sometimes to see into the future. Like, same reason we have trouble saving for retirement. We don't really think about those things. And as a teenager, right, instant gratification, seeing things on social media, seeing your peers or maybe other athletes who have made the jump and professionalized it, lifting a ton of weight. But it depends who you're looking at. If you're looking at someone like Tudor Magna, who's strong as hell, or you're looking at somebody who just has more gymnastics, better engine, but bombs the strength events, like your barometer for how you measure success is usually your, not necessarily your peers, but your idols, who you're looking at on Instagram.
Yeah, and that can be a dangerous game because then you're always chasing something that's a little bit better than where you're at now. And chasing that can be a good thing, but it also can cause burnout or injury. To that point, I think that simplifying it the way that you're talking about, where it's almost like, let's look at the movements that have been tested. Let's look at the loading that's been tested. Go to the competitions that you want to do and look at past workouts and simplify it that way for the athlete to say, like, here are the things that are commonly tested and the loading that's commonly tested, the time domains, and then you can start to identify the weaknesses or the strengths that you have and come up with a sound program. So to that point then, if someone comes to you, you do the assessment, what's the process like for a teen athlete versus the 25-year-old higher level athlete?
For sure. I think there's a lot of variables that come into play. How much time do they have on their hands outside of either school or working? What is their access in their gym? So here we're very fortunate. We have an on-site environment that's set up to train, but a lot of people are working outside of their CrossFit gyms where maybe they don't have open gym all the time. They don't have all the specialty tools. And I think people can get really wrapped up and stressed about that because, like I said, movements keep being added and loads are changing. So I think you have to organize your schedule first. Like, what do the logistics look like? What days you have to get up early or stay up late, and try to leverage your strong days? Like, what days do I feel strong because of maybe my schedule, and put your hard days on those days. So even from a stress intensity standpoint, almost think of it high-low. My high days are the days I typically feel good, and try to put the things that are a little bit more challenging on those days. So
in other words, I have heavy school days on Tuesdays and Fridays. I should probably back off on those days, but Mondays and Wednesdays I don't have anything, or only one class that day.
Exactly. Okay. So that's honestly where I start. I try to start with their schedule because I think it just makes more sense. You want to put their energy where they need the most energy. And then there's just like things you're not going to expect, like you are having boy trouble or girl trouble, and like you have the exams. Yeah. And so
does that not play out with adults too?
No, 100% it does. And it's like a reactive deloading sometimes where you have to do those types of things. But teens are ridiculously resilient. Yeah. They make progress really fast and they recover so much faster than adults. So I don't want to say you can throw the kitchen sink at them, but a lot of them you kind of can. But you can fall into the trap also of rushing things too. Sure. Like not prioritizing movement quality, which they have an opportunity to do now. They're starting so much earlier. Like, I didn't start CrossFit till I was 26. And like,
you're giving away your age.
Yeah. 10 years ago. Yeah. But, and I fell into the same trap as an adult of wanting to rush progress and getting hurt. So it's the same principles. It's the same story. You're just talking with somebody that has less perspective and life experience, but a ton of physical resiliency, which also makes them super exciting to work with.
Yeah. Yeah. You talked about movement quality. Where does that come in, and how do you assess and then train that? If someone comes to you that, most 16-year-olds move relatively well, at least compared to the masters athlete you're working with, right? Okay. But there are
Shots fired.
It's true. But there are some, like I can remember in high school, I moved really, really well. And then after a couple years of football, started getting some aches and pains, and all of a sudden the squat position was a little iffy. What do you do with those athletes? Are you telling them to, hey, we have time and now let's go ahead and reset this so that you can move well? Or are you just trying to push forward with what they have?
I think it depends. If there's a pretty obvious problem that you're like, if we don't address this and you continue to put load and intensity on this, it's going to be an injury down the line. I have to address it. I don't want to say stop them in their tracks, but like say it's something like valgus knee in a squat. Like, we can train tempo squats and we can improve this now, and you're still going to get better at those things. You just don't necessarily have to go heavy all the time. That can also be hard, but if you teach them the importance of those things and those principles of training earlier on, they're way easier to work with, I think, down the line. It's like your principles and values and educating them on like why this is important now, I think can make a huge difference. But it can also be difficult. Like, if their athletic background doesn't have any strength training, or for instance, like a lot of swimmers I've seen, this is not everybody, but they typically have some harder times with bounding, or just weight bearing exercise in general. Their bone density, if they're swimming in a pool like for 10 years, like it's just going to be different than somebody who ran around playing football and crashing into people. And that stuff takes time. And even tendon strength in your shoulders, ligaments, all that stuff, like getting into kipping. Like I try to start with strict gymnastics and teach them those principles right away, because they're going to be way better down the line. That being said, like I also don't, my personal philosophy is someone doesn't have to move 100% perfectly until we can move on to the next thing, because I think it's going to stall the progress. Like if you see a squat with a little bit of valgus knee, and that's a pattern that they have for a long time, and I say, you're not going to go up in weight until that's never there anymore, I don't know if they're ever going to go up in weight. And maybe you need to be creative and use a different type of squat pattern or a different type of knee flexion pattern to correct that, but make sure that they're always feeling like they're making progress. Because if you just put limits on somebody and have hard and fast rules, I think it takes the fun out of it. It's like not enjoyable.
So it's also creating like the emotional success along with the actual performance success. That
how important is fun with coaching teens?
I think it's my number one. To Brannen's point about getting burnout, I think if they're not having fun and they get too caught up in the competitive side of it, I don't think they're going to last long in the sport. And I think that holds true for any sport, like baseball, soccer, football. How many athletes make it to a pretty high level and would be considered successful? They hate it. Yeah. They never want to do it again because there's so much pressure put on them.
But do you think there are some athletes that just can handle it? Like I have to imagine that there was at some point in, let's just pick Tiger Woods or, I'm going to say Tom Brady because Chris hates it when I talk about Tom Brady, a great person like that, one of the best that's ever done it.
One of the best to ever lose massive amounts of money in FTX.
Yes, he lost tons of money. How about this dude is just on an apology tour now, and everyone's praising the.
Wait, who's on apology tour?
The Sam Bankman-Fried.
I thought you meant Brady. I was like,
they're letting this guy go because he's donated money to both parties, but it's such a scam, man. It's unbelievable. Seriously, New York Times is like, oh, it was a rough time for him.
He did a little talk.
Yes, and people are clapping. Thank you for your honesty for stealing $8 billion. That's
wild.
That's a side note. That's just insane to me that we let people get away.
Tom Brady.
Tom Brady, yes.
There had to be at some point where those athletes hated what they were doing. Simone Biles probably hated what she was doing, but she had the grit, the tenacity to get through it. I don't know what that word would be. Something special that allowed them to get through it. If you have someone like that, do you still need to make it fun for them?
I think their definition of fun is different. Or
fun is winning for them?
Yeah, 100, yeah.
I see that.
If they feel like they can continue to make progress and be the best. I also think those individuals at the highest level, they are just different.
Yeah. They have something wired that's completely different than everyone else.
So I think they're maybe anomalies. They're on one extreme end of the spectrum where they don't care. They want to win, and that's what's most important to them. So they don't need as much balance and perspective necessarily, or they're so determined to get to where they want to go. And then sometimes they get there, and then they realize it wasn't what they expected, and they do need to kind of reconsider other priorities. But I think that's just an evolution of great athletes. Like, they still want to be great.
Yeah. So having fun with an athlete, like what does that mean with a team? Like, how are you programming for them?
On average, view a fun session for training?
Yeah. I ask people this all the time, actually. Oh, that workout looks fun. That was fun. And to me, I'm like, that was a bloodbath. But that is fun to some people. Yeah. So for me, all right, so I'll just reflect on my own experience as an athlete. And I wasn't anything great. I made it to pretty high levels of different types of sports, but I was never the best. And I just kind of really liked doing a lot of different things and being pretty good at them. But that's what I cared about. I did not necessarily care about winning. So I think for athletes who want to get better, having fun is actually the things that challenge them. It's not necessarily setbacks, because I think that perspective comes way after they get through those things, but actually being challenged and being successful from those challenges. So from the programming point of view, writing things that may be a little bit out of reach and seeing if they can be successful and overcome some barriers. Sometimes that doesn't always pan out. But I think fun is in the challenge of the sport. I think any athlete that's competitive, that's what it is. It's not necessarily winning all the time, though I guess just for some people it is. And those people are going to realize that you are not going to win all the time. And there's only one winner. So if you put all your eggs in that basket and that's what fun means to you, then you're probably not going to have much fun. But I think everyone has a different definition of it.
Yeah. How do you balance those, quote unquote, bloodbath sessions where people are having fun? I think that's true, right? Like that's true for me and you even now. Like we're going to go throw down. We want to do a workout with each other. We're still picking something that's relatively hard and we push ourselves. But how do we balance that with the other things that maybe are boring, the skill-based stuff? Like, hey, they need to learn how to have a more efficient bar muscle up. And that may not be fun in the moment, but it's fun once you get it.
Yeah. I think some of that comes down to communication and giving them an explanation of why they're doing something. Very typically, people who are driven will do whatever you tell them to do, and they're going to have way more buy-in if you tell them why you're doing it. The bloodbath workouts, like the things that I think got a lot of people into CrossFit, myself too, the workouts that are very, very challenging, but maybe you're doing them with other people, so you have this shared suffering camaraderie. I think those need to be sprinkled in. I think sometimes in here, it can get tricky balancing individual priorities, like this person needs to get better at this thing, so I want to make sure I write the perfect progression to do that, and training with other people. And maybe just training a variety of things in a different way where you're racing them or you're working together as a team. And I think having a variety, I've actually feel like I've tried to do that a little bit more this year. And I'm going to continue to do that because getting outside of your box of like, these people are not robots, they're humans. They want to balance fun and getting better. So how do we find a way to do that together and not making it stale and making it so that they can continue to see progress? But the teens, I think like if we had a teen class here or say a United Performance, I think you have to be tricky with too many bloodbath workouts. Tricky? You need to be careful because they can get tricky. 30-plus minute, Murph kind of like hard beatdowns are not great for kids like that, especially over and over and over again, and especially if they're trying to keep up with adults, right? It makes them feel inferior, or maybe it pushes them a little bit harder than they should. Like teens are way more susceptible to getting rhabdo than adults, and they're like the signs and indications of them getting it are not as obvious.
Right.
So like
what would those signs be for a teen?
It's like the cola color P, extreme soreness, like inability to like move a muscle. I think feelings of weakness, and from what I've seen, they only have usually one sign. They present with one sign of that versus adults will have like all three.
The adults in the bed.
Yeah, and they might not. And they might not say anything because they're like, oh well, especially in a CrossFit gym, you're like, that's normal.
Right. Everyone's complaining of soreness like this.
Exactly. So you do have to be more careful. So I don't really throw those things at them too often unless they are very, very competitive in the sport and they have been training volume and intensity progressively to get to that point. But like partner workouts can be nice because there's built-in rest, like for something like that, 30, 60 minutes. And
some accountability with another athlete to push yourself.
Exactly.
Let's take a step back. I want to get back to the movement quality side of things because you talked about you don't want to stay so focused on something that progress can't be seen. And I think we agree there. But at what point do you say to the athlete that the movement economy is so bad that you can't move forward? Is there a point in the training that you would say that to someone?
I think so. And I think you can either have that conversation and create limitations, or you can let them get exposed. And then you have that conversation. And then now they actually have evidence where it's like, wow, that actually really impacted me. I thought I was good at pull-ups, but they just broke down so hard. So that also gives them...
I love that you just said that.
More motivation.
Like let them fail.
Let them fail.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If you don't let them fail, the failures are what... like they remember. Because
we can preach all this shit, but no one really changes crap until they fail.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's part of being in a sport. Like,
how do you do that though without them just saying, you know what, screw this, I'm done? Because that also happens, right? You let someone fail a couple times and you say, hey, look, this is what we were talking about. And they're like, I need another coach.
Yep.
Shouldn't have been here. Go home.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm that gentle. Like, I think I can be, but at a certain point in time, like, they're a teenager, but you are a small adult. Like if you want to be competitive, I think there has to be a conversation about what that means.
Sure.
You have to put reality and set expectations. Like, and like I said, sometimes you have to let them fail, and then they can make that decision, and then you kind of know where they are, right? And to say maybe they don't actually want to be that competitive, they just thought they did, and that illuminated their desire to keep going, or like put in the hours or put in the work, because they can't mentally deal with getting beat all the time. You might make a suggestion to like just adjust the priority and adjust or lower the expectation. That's another thing people don't like to do, especially those who feel they're very highly competitive. It's like, lower my expectation. Like, what? That's being soft. I mean, I guess if you frame it that way, but maybe you are just absolutely completely off of what you thought you could possibly do.
Right. Yeah. So staying on the movement quality side of things, are there movements in particular that you're looking at, or that you would tell the team that they need to identify first? You know, maybe it's just like a basic squat pattern or overhead pattern that they need to have good movement quality, or are you just assessing those based on the movements that come out? So in other words, instead of looking at a squat pattern, how that person's thrusters or wall balls or whatever else may come out? Yeah,
squat pattern 100%, because there's so much squatting in the sport. I would say the Olympic lifts and gymnastics. Like, I would probably, if I were starting with a teen who was like green, brand new, it's a blank canvas, I would probably have a fairly straightforward Olympic weightlifting program and a strict gymnastics program. And that's where I'd start. And then teach them some of the machine stuff, so just they understand pacing, and depending on what, you know, if they have an endurance.
So what did you leave out just there?
All the CrossFit movements.
Yeah.
I think they can.
Like what?
Box jumps, wall balls, step overs, lunging, like CrossFit, burpees, dumbbell stuff, barbell cycling, because I think you can teach somebody how to barbell cycle if they can snatch and clean and jerk really well. Like, their bar path is so much better. I mean, I have some athletes right now that are coming from weightlifting and have come from weightlifting. Barbell cycling is the easiest thing outside of the cardiovascular aspect of them being able to understand how to breathe.
Right.
But they move so well in all of the movements in CrossFit. They can jump on a box. They can do all of that stuff because there's carryover from the sport. I think that's another reason why gymnasts pick up weightlifting so much faster. They understand body awareness. They understand core control. They understand breathing and just proprioception. So pairing those two together, I think, are a match made in heaven. And that's, I mean, 70% of the sport right there.
Yeah.
So that's probably where I'd start. And if they have no cardiovascular endurance, then you need to do some of that. But that can actually be promoting to the recovery. Like, if you do implement zone 2 work, that can absolutely help their CrossFit without actually doing CrossFit.
Well, that's the thing that someone's going to ask you, right? The teen, you give them an Olympic lifting program, you focus on strength numbers or metrics and some gymnastics. They're going to say, well, where's the CrossFit? So how are you incorporating that into their weekly training plan to make sure that they feel like they're getting enough?
Yeah, I think it depends. I think it depends what they want. I think there are periods of time where you need to add more, and there's periods of time where you can subtract it. And I think some of that's associated with just burnout of, like, some people don't like repetition. They find it boring. A lot of people come to CrossFit because it's constantly novel. It's different. They like the variety, but it's also really hard to get good at a lot of different things if you're just doing different stuff all the time. That's a good question. I mean, the athletes that we work with here, like, they're pretty focused, and we also have group sessions and throwdowns that are built into our culture. So that's like right away, I'm like, those are your CrossFit sessions.
Yeah.
That's your socialization. That's your throwing down. That's your hard stuff. And that model has worked out really well, where they're doing CrossFit 2 to 3 times a week, doing some partner workouts, and then their individualized training is like, works around their schedule when they feel good.
What about introducing the other movements? So you talked about gymnastics and Olympic lifting. Let's just call it like true strength work, like strict gymnastics, Olympic powerlifting, whatever. But you did say box jumps and dumbbell work and, you know, maybe the wall balls and body weight movements. How do you introduce the skills so that they are competent to put those into a CrossFit workout at some point?
I don't think I've had to do that, like the blank canvas scenario. I've never actually had that.
Because they've come to you with those
background.
skills. Yeah.
So honestly, if I were to advise someone, I would say put them in CrossFit classes, because CrossFit coaches and CrossFit classes will give them the variety. It'll give them exposure. It'll give them enough coaching to understand the movement. And I don't think people also realize how much they learn from watching other people. Like, they're going to watch other adults in their class do it. They're going to do it. They're going to base their strategy and assessment of how good they are at it based on that. They're going to watch YouTube videos of Matt Fraser and Tia doing it, and they're going to take all that information and they're probably going to refine it themselves. Yeah. You don't necessarily have to teach them everything from the ground up. And I think, why not leverage the CrossFit community also? You're competing in a sport that is a community-based sport that's backed by gyms and people who, it's very rare that like people actually do the sport that they're also doing for fitness, right? Like, how many people go out and play football for fitness, right?
Yeah.
Or like, yes, there's some recreational sports out there that you can make that your fitness and also your outlet. But that's what I think's awesome about CrossFit and CrossFit gyms.
So for the parent that if they called you up and said, hey, I have a 14-year-old that wants to get into CrossFit, would you tell them to go to a CrossFit gym first or to hire a one-on-one coach?
I would tell them to go to CrossFit gym first. It's the same reason I would tell them, hey, ask them, hey, does your kid play sports? Good, keep them in sports for the next few years. And if you can have that conversation, if it's like clear, they're getting very, very good, all right, it makes sense to specialize a little bit more. But I just think it depends where they are. I think keeping them in a group model, unless it's very dysfunctional for whatever reason, as long as they can and as long as they're enjoying it, is absolutely good. Not only for just development, but socialization.
Sure.
Like, you get, then if you start putting pressure on yourself to be really good at something because you're specializing in it, that's just a different mindset. Yeah. And for a 14-year-old, like, sure, like, what, gymnasts peak at, I don't know, 16 or something like that.
Young.
Yeah. And so that's a whole different rabbit hole and conversation of like, what is good for a child.
So one of the things that you'll notice if you look at the leaderboard of the teens that come into the individual divisions are the females are much more dominant or much more competitive, maybe is a better word, than the males. Why is that? And do you think that will ever change?
I think that will hold true.
Yeah.
I think biology is part of it, and biology is in like their physical bodies and their hormones, and also maturity. Yeah. Like, I just think women are more likely to hire a coach earlier on, to have guidance, actually adhere and listen to them. I mean, definitely is true. What, like males are, males are risk takers. Yeah. They have competitive drive. They want to push the boundaries probably a little bit earlier. And I just think women are a little more logical. The strength aspect is very interesting because you're seeing a lot of these young women they're snatching 200 pounds. Yeah. And they're not necessarily big girls. And I think a lot of that comes down to technique, like the movement quality. If you develop good technique, then I don't know when Mal and Emma Carey and Olivia started, but I think 11, 12, and they were taught the right way, you can just lift a lot more. You learn how to use your body. So I think they did those things. I think they also started specializing early.
So I guess that's another question for you is, when should someone start? Like, when would you recommend someone to specialize in CrossFit?
I think that's a hard question to answer. I think it depends on the person. Like, I suppose if it is very clear that's their desire, they want to specialize early, they're showing promise and signs of that coming true. And that is a whole different conversation that's very hard to have with not just the child, but the parent. Like, the parent who's supporting, who's funding all this, who's driving their kids to the gym, who's hiring the coach, very invested in their child being successful, being honest with where they are and what you see as their potential, I think can be a very hard conversation. But I think if you had somebody like a Mal, for instance, who she's been here before, we met her a little bit and been around her, it's very clear she's cut from a different cloth. I think that's a different answer than 99% of the other teens. Yeah. My bias is to keep kids in sports as long as they want to be in other sports. But obviously, if they want to specialize in CrossFit, like if I was a parent, I would want to support that.
Yeah.
Especially if I said there's signs of them being very successful. But my bias is just to keep kids in sports. I think once you specialize, it just creates a whole different amount of attention and a pressure. You're doing it for different reasons potentially. And I think it can actually take the fun out of it.
Sure. Do you think that there are the same dangers to specialize in CrossFit as maybe, we've talked about this in the past, but baseball is a good example, especially with pitchers. These young boys, especially that are throwing overhand, are, have no pitch counts in some states. And so they may throw 80 to 100 pitches, and then the next night, because coaches don't understand the complexities to throwing a baseball at really high speeds, they throw another 80 to 100 pitches, and they do that over and over again, and all of a sudden they need surgery on their elbow because they've ruined themselves at 15 or 16 years old.
For a sport that sucks. What a waste.
Wow.
Like, oh my gosh. At least get hurt in football or basketball.
Half our audience
don't get hurt
out.
in baseball.
You're such a hater. Yeah. You're such a hater. Baseball's not my favorite sport, but it's still an amazing
Can we cancel it?
talent.
We're canceling everything. Can we cancel baseball? For the love of God.
I understand what you're saying, but I love baseball.
What, are you about to be
Perrin
one of these people
baseball.
who's like, I love going to a game for the hot dog and the beer?
No.
That's what half the people who answer this question say.
No. I almost
just
love
ignore
it.
him.
Yeah, I love it more because I think it's the antithesis of our society right now.
I agree with you.
Wait, baseball is the antithesis of our...
It's the slow. I do agree with that.
I
need
see what you're
some
saying.
of that. We need to pull back and relax and,
well,
and pay
that
attention.
only makes it work. Like I was saying all this back in like 2005. It's probably like brutal now.
Yeah,
I get it.
I'd much rather watch football or basketball, so I agree with you to that point. But I actually have appreciated sports like baseball more recently because of the fast-paced society that we live in. I don't like hot dogs, actually, believe it or not. But going back to the conversation, that's something that has been a huge deal. And now many states do have pitch counts. Many of these high school associations and others have regulated this because they want to protect these kids. But still, you talked about Mal, and I agree. When she was here, you could tell that she is cut from a different cloth. But most parents think that their kid is also cut from a different cloth, and then they put them into something, and maybe they don't think that they're pressuring them, but when you sign them up for multiple things, plus an expensive one-on-one coach, or they go to these competitions, and the kid may want that, but at some point the pressure is so high, and then the volume is also so high in the sport, it seems to me that there could be danger there, but I'm not sure because we haven't really seen that play out yet. Like, we don't know. Like, we're just now getting through the original kids that went through the 2015-16 games to now they're turning into young adults.
How many of those kids panned out?
Quite a few.
A bunch.
Well, at least on the female side.
Yeah.
The males really have not compared to the female side.
100%.
Yeah.
There's definitely pitfalls. I think it's the same scenario. And to the point I made earlier, the sport has evolved so much that when you walk into the games, what are the minimum standards of what you can snatch, clean and jerk, back squat, do in gymnastics? It is not the same as even 3 years ago. So to get to that level, it is such a higher mountain to climb. That's why I think if you actually approach it intelligently from the beginning, you actually have a better likelihood of getting there now versus I think the people who adopted it early on, even the Alexises, kind of just messed around for a while and got pretty good. But then that didn't stop working.
Sure.
So I think that all of the same pitfalls of having to get Tommy John is the same as having to get labrum surgery when you're 16 years old, or back surgery, or just having chronic issues that you don't address because you're like, well, I need to be able to snatch and do muscle ups, and my shoulder kind of hurts, but if I get it checked out, maybe something's actually wrong, and then I have to get surgery and I have to miss this next year. And once again, that instant gratification of just wanting to continue to improve gets really hard to manage just in your head of having to stop, of having to take a step back. With injuries are just part of sport, especially at the highest level. Everybody has run into them. Even thought Tia was like never going to have an injury, and it happened eventually. It's hard, and I think if you do have a coach that is understanding and paying attention, and the communication is good, where the athlete actually is very honest about what they're feeling, and you once again educate the importance of like, hey, let's not make a little problem a big problem. Let's nip it in the bud right now. Yeah, you have Wadapalooza in 2 weeks. this could be an issue. But what is the ultimate goal, right? The ultimate goal is quarterfinals or the games. Those conversations, I think, become really important the higher they get in that sport, and having guidance and support of somebody that wants the best for you and your future, and not necessarily just wants to say that they coached a competitive team to the games this year. But those are the same things that happen in youth sports, in systems where, like, so baseball or team sports, I think it's a little bit different, because once you get to college, right, getting to college or playing for a D1 school, and then it's like, all right, am I going to go pro or minor league or not? There's constraints there. You're either kind of going to make it into the system or you're not. But with CrossFit, it is interesting because you could actually take a few years off, still do it, do some other things, maintain a lot of your good qualities, or maybe even shift focuses, do Olympic weightlifting for a few years. Maybe you realize it's a weight class sport. I could actually be a lot better at this than I can be at CrossFit. And then you're like, all right, I want to do CrossFit again. And I got tons stronger and learn a lot about weightlifting. So I think there's more ability to kind of pivot based on everything that you learn from CrossFit, not to mention it's just, it's a fitness program.
Yeah. There are so many things you have to be good at. You're not actually specializing in one thing. So it's not like the pitcher that's throwing the ball as fast as they can over and over and over again. It's you're squatting one day, you're pulling the next day, you're doing gymnastics, you're running. So do you think the variance will keep people healthier for longer?
I think it can, if they approach it intelligently. Sure. And that's also just very subjective. I think taking time off of CrossFit is also hugely important. And when I say CrossFit, I mean doing everything, doing all the variety, and like having off seasons where maybe I'm going to go run a half marathon or do a triathlon or something like that, or try rock climbing or try powerlifting meet, try weightlifting meet. All of those have utility and carry over into the sport. Yeah. And that's another amazing thing about the sport is, like, especially if it's a whole, you see people all the time, probably both ends of the spectrum. I think Chris Diermo just did a triathlon or something like that. Or I've had people who are bad at bad at endurance sports, and they go and they're like, I'm going to make it a goal to do this triathlon because it's something that's really challenging for me. And they do it, and they get better at CrossFit.
Yeah. Well, it's something that's been tested, too, in the sport, or similar variations at least. And we've seen the best do that. Rich used to do that all the time. He would do different variations, long run events, or he's done all the different triathlons. The same thing for others that are at a high level. So I do think that makes sense. To kind of finish off the specializing side of things. So I guess the way that I would look at it is most CrossFitters that come into the sport, they still specialize in a certain thing that they're bad at. So maybe the answer to it is, even if you want to just focus on CrossFit, it would be going back to your point of still create variance within your training program. Throughout the year, maybe it is just focusing on some, powerlifting and then Olympic lifting and then doing some long, slow work, as opposed to it always being, I'm going to pound the squats because I need to get stronger on that. And then you end up being injured.
Yeah. Sorry, what was your question?
No, I was just that was more of a statement.
Yeah.
But I think that in general, it would probably be wise for people, young kids, and even adults that are in the sport to go and do other things throughout the off season.
Yeah, and I think to complement CrossFit, and I don't know if this is intentional, but sometimes their messaging points it this way. I think the reason why they do throw different movements and over program or emphasize certain things in different competitions is because they want people getting out of the mindset that CrossFit is just telephone booth movements, thrusters and burpees and pull-ups. It is also swimming. It's riding a bike. It's learning how to play sports and have variance in your life. And at the end of the day, I think that was the original message of Greg Glassman. He introduced gymnastics in a way that you could actually measure and quantify it and race people. Those movements, I guess CrossFit's made up. Was a butterfly pull-up a thing?
Yeah, I don't think so.
So we have an amazing way to test a movement, and then the amount of people that are testing it, somebody is going to figure out the fastest way to do it.
For sure.
Create efficiency. And I think that's an awesome thing about the sport, but also something that drives people crazy.
Yeah. No, I do too. I think the problem is that it's still very biased in one direction. You talk about go learn and play new sports, but it's, yes, they threw a softball one time at the games, but they're not throwing footballs and baseballs or hitting balls or catching anything. So that side of athleticism is not tested, nor I don't think it should be by any means. Like, I think it should just be a true fitness sport. And then I still think that there should be standards and then create chaos within the standards. But
Sure.
it would make the sport grow. Like, and everyone that listens has heard me rant on that.
Yeah.
But just in general, I do agree that it has pushed us to a new level. Now, this brings me back to a question that I was thinking of just a few minutes ago. You talked about how the teen divisions, the testing has changed. It has become more complicated. It has become heavier, and the 1RMs in general have gone up significantly. I don't know the actual percentage, but over the last couple of years, it has spiked. Is that a good idea to continue to push those numbers by CrossFit when they're programming, or should they just have a set standard of like, kind of, here are the tests, just get really good at these things so that we're not pushing our younger athletes to always have to get stronger at a young age and then risk that injury?
Dang, that's a good question.
I know. I feel like I think there should be limitations for teens, because I just have a little bit of an ethical problem with like you're basically, if you keep making it harder for teens and make them try to do what the adults are doing, yeah, for some of them that's exciting and it's something to reach for, but I think it becomes a point where it becomes dangerous. I feel the same way about masters. I think upping the ante is good, but I think there's a better way to do it. And the masters and teens programming has changed similar, because they usually they have the same stuff.
Yeah.
So I have coached more masters at the highest level, so I can speak to that. But I think it's the same thing. I think there has to be a point where it's like, what are the limits? What are the limits on what weights you're going to test inside of sport? And then if they're so disconnected from the tests that you tested in the open and quarterfinals and semifinals, like that jump to me doesn't really make any sense. It's also super confusing. Like, you don't know what to train people for anymore.
Right.
And if you're trying to take a teenager that is still developing, do you think it's appropriate to actually just be throwing a ton of weight at them over and over and over again and trying to make it harder? So I would say I have a little bit of an issue with that, but I also haven't coached that many teens at the games level, and I do feel like it's clear they're getting better.
Sure.
So what's the trade-off between balance and not making it challenging anymore?
Yeah, I think the challenge there, though, is still that the best are always going to show up and relatively execute to the test. Yeah. The problem is everyone else. So it's the same thing as the sport continues to evolve at the individual level, and they continue to add more load, more complexity, and they say that we're pushing everyone to get better. But yes, the elite athletes are going to continue to get better, and they'll adapt to all of these things that they're throwing out. But if we're continuing to do that to our group classes who are also following that model, everything trickles down, and then you're just adding so much chaos that people can't actually improve. So yeah, they improve at maybe that skill, but it's like, what about health and longevity? What about the actual strength metrics that will keep us stronger for longer and keep our bone density the way that it should be when we're 60 and 70, as opposed to having joint pain because now I have to do pistols at 150 in a quarterfinal workout. Yep. So those are the kind of things I think that concern me, is like, there is a way to test the best without having everything have to trickle down where everyone feels like they need to also learn these skills.
I completely agree. Another thing I don't think people think about, unless you're competing as a masters and teens, they just have less time in the day to train because they're either at school or they have jobs. And then, like I said, having to share facilities with a CrossFit gym, try to get all these specialty tools. Like, I just think the training needs to be reduced down to the essentials, and they don't need to worry about all of the, being exposed by the unknown and unknowable as much. I think it should be known and knowable, and why don't they just get very good at that?
Yeah.
But the stress that some people have is like, legless pegboards just came out, crossovers, all of these things. You just added all of these movements. Now that people that don't even have the ability to be full-time athletes unless you remove them from school. So now you're like, okay, well, I have to be homeschooled or stop school or don't go to college if I want to get better at this sport. You're promoting that,
sure.
Which, yeah, sure, maybe that is the future, and clearly that's happened for some athletes that have been super successful, but is that something that you want to be promoting in your sport, like to professionalize teenage CrossFit, competitive CrossFit? Maybe.
Yeah. I would love it to be a developmental stage to the individual CrossFit games. It would be, to me, a much more beautiful process, keep them safer, and then you would have many athletes that basically are going from the 17, 18 division right into the individual, and they'll be competitive. Now, I know that's happening again on the female side, but I think we can get some males. That there are plenty of strong 18-year-old males that have all the skills, but they're just not developing quite the same way as maybe the female athletes.
You mentioned money earlier. Is more money coming into the teen stuff? Because I remember David said when he won, he didn't get any special prize. He didn't get no all he got was the free Reebok gear that they gave him. That everyone got.
It's just like the Masters. It's like a huge difference. I think it might have been bumped up slightly, but it's still a large percentage less.
I mean, it's tough, right? Like, people aren't going there to watch the teens of the Masters, and I think most people can objectively look at that.
To y'all's point, by having the money low, it probably keeps it where you're preventing what you're talking about.
Yeah, but now you're also seeing
people
Mal O'Brien and Emma Lawson being signed by Noble for probably 6-figure contracts. So, like, there's incentive. I think now that there's money just coming into the sport, there's always going to be incentive when there's money.
Yeah, I agree. Let's wrap it up with going back to, we're talking to the teen now, the person that's watching that wants to be a competitive athlete. Let's kind of have a holistic view of a year. And you can keep this relatively broad, but what are the things, again, that they should identify, like identify the strengths and weaknesses, and then program for? Like, what are the movements? Should they have it really complex? Should they keep it simple? What movements should they be making sure that they're focusing on? How should they incorporate CrossFit and all the skills of the sport?
I would probably look into the themes, right? What workouts do you typically do bad on, or what workouts are you afraid of? That alone, if they answer those questions, you'll probably get a lot of information there. It's always going to be a strength event. The strength events always stress me out, or high skill gymnastics. That right there, you can set your priorities there. These are the things that I need to make sure I'm touching on frequently, and have a progressive plan that we just make sure we check the box, and then probably test and retest a little bit more frequently than everything else. And then keeping in just a level of variety. I think if they're doing a CrossFit class, or even they're following something like Compete, RX intermediate path, you're gonna hit all those, you're gonna check all those boxes, you're gonna hit those movements enough in 4-week blocks that you're gonna have touches. So I think like a teen could probably follow a similar group program if they want to train on their own and have something a little bit more structured than a CrossFit class. I think there's difficulty sometimes when now the programming doesn't line up.
Right.
So that's why sometimes I think I would recommend to somebody potentially following a separate strength program. Say you need to just get stronger, you need to get better at deadlift, back squat, and press. Maybe you follow a Wendler 531, or maybe you follow a Catalyst Olympic weightlifting program, or join a weightlifting club. If you are serious about getting better at those things, if snatching, clean and jerking always crush you in Metcons as a strength event, but I probably wouldn't overcomplicate it. How much time do you have to train? How much do you want to put into it? And then hone in on less goals and be a little bit more specific, not necessarily trying to get better at everything at once. What's your bread and butter? What are the things that are going to have a lot more carryover into getting better at the sport a year, 2, 3, 4 down the line?
Yeah. And then what about let's just call them like the gymnastic skills, the basic things that come out in the open and quarterfinals? Hey, I don't have ring muscle ups, or that's the workout. If you ask me what scares me, I could do a couple, but then all of a sudden I'm failing them. What should that teen athlete look to get better at a specific movement like that?
Yeah, probably the intermediate path of Compete. The same thing we usually tell other people, because learning how to do the skills takes time, and you don't have to spend a ton of time on it, but you need to touch it frequently, and I promise you will get better. So if you take some steps back, take maybe some movements out of Metcons that you can't do, or they break down after 20 reps, and work on them independently, and then scale. I would say scale if you're doing a CrossFit class. Scale that movement to a strict strength exercise, because if you build strength and you slow yourself down a little bit, I promise it's going to be a lot easier when you're practicing your kipping pull-ups if you actually have grip strength and lat strength to be able to practice them. Because if you're not strong, you can't even practice the movement. And then another one I think is very underutilized is bodybuilding. Especially for anyone who's lacking upper body strength. Typically a younger female, right? Lat pull downs and preacher curls and tricep extensions. That stuff is not bad. And if you actually do a little bit of bodybuilding, it doesn't even have to be a lot, consistently as well, I guarantee your gymnastics are going to improve faster than if you were not.
Chris and I are going to crush that bodybuilding today, baby. All right. Thanks for coming on.
Hold on. I just want to give a slight apology to all the baseball people out there.
Yeah, you should.
You feel like you need to make up for it?
I still feel awkward about that.
I mean, if you play it, then that's even better. But they have great movies. They have great movies.
Yes.
The best movies.
The best movies. Well, other than Remember the Titans, the best movies are.
But as a sport, who has better movies than baseball?
None.
Nobody.
Yeah. The collection of movies.
Yes.
Yes. However, the best sport movies, Remember the Titans.
Okay, well, whatever. I mean, I
know many people will disagree.
No,
then it's Field of Dreams, and then everything.
To be fair, baseball people, I watch NASCAR, so you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Take
That's
me
the
with
worst
a grain
sport.
of salt.
No.
What are you even watching?
The cars go in a
left.
circle. Yeah, turn
and
left.
occasionally road courses.
Occasionally, as in what, like 3 times a year?
I think it's 8.
Is it really that
6
many?
or 8.
Wow,
yeah.
I'm so off. Clearly, I don't watch NASCAR.
Yeah.
The thing is baseball is still such a homegrown sport. So you offended 80% of the audience.
What do you mean homegrown?
Well, so you wonder how baseball stays afloat because they don't have a national audience. It's the regional audiences that keep the advertisers there. So, for example,
do your part, people. Stop watching, and they'll finally pull the cord.
Yeah, but I guess my point is everyone would watch the 2 football teams play. There'll be 15 million viewers, even if they don't live there. Like let's say I live in Florida, I'm watching the Vikings play because I'm interested in the NFL. People aren't watching a team from Minnesota play if they live in Florida in baseball. So
it's true.
Yeah,
I'm biased though because I worked for a baseball organization.
Oh yeah, you were with the Phillies. Didn't they win this year?
They did not win the World
no.
Series.
They did not.
Thanks for bringing that up again.
But this was the first time
they were close, right?
So the last time they made it to the World Series was the year I was a ball girl, 2009. So it was very
So what? Got any good ball girl stories?
Yeah, but we don't have time for that.
Huh?
Sure we do. We're sitting here.
Yeah.
Man. I almost got my head taken off by a foul ball. So the year, my second year, you could only do a 2-year stint. Was the last year we got away with not wearing helmets on the field. Now you will always see someone with a helmet on. So I was wearing a regular hat, and I'm sitting.
So you're in game.
Oh, I'm sitting on the field. Yeah, that was part of the job.
Yeah, sorry, I guess I don't know what a ball girl does.
You sit on the first and third baseline in foul territory, and so when a ball it's hit foul but it ricochets and it's on the field, you need someone to get the ball off the field right away.
So you're sprinting to the ball.
Running
it's
to
like
the ball.
The tennis person that's getting the tennis ball.
Yeah, or there was another process where it would be really exciting when they had a relief pitcher come through the bullpen. You would run to the bullpen, get their jacket, and run it to the dugout. You're basically a jacket runner. Yeah, I like that one better.
How tiring was that? Would you sprint?
It was just the games were tiring because you're always on alert because of this story I'm about to tell.
Okay.
But like you don't want to interfere with the game. So sometimes it's hard to tell. The ball comes down the line and you're not sure if it's foul or fair. So you just need to get out of the way. So you're sitting on this tiny ass chair that's like barely covers your butt. But so you need to put your hand behind it, pick up the chair and run at the opposite direction of the ball. But sometimes you don't know where the ball's going because it'll hit the wall.
Wait, why do you got to pick up the chair?
Because I'm sitting on the chair, and if the ball is fair, I can't touch the ball because if I touch the ball, it stops play and they get a double, and like the players will get very mad if you interfere. It's interference. Fired. It's interference.
Did that ever happen to you?
No, but it happened to somebody else.
Did they get fired?
I don't think they got fired, but they were not top 10. Oof. You don't want to be on not top 10. But anyway, so a guy hit a line drive at my head. I mean,
you mean like the ESPN? Not top.
Yeah.
Okay. I was like, what do you mean? Who's trying to be top 10 ball girl?
A batter hit a foul ball, and it is coming straight in my head. And I luckily ducked and got out of the way, and it hit the fan next to me. But I will remember that super clear because the umpire walked all the way down and came to me, and he was like, "Why are you not wearing a helmet?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm sorry."
Why weren't you wearing a helmet? Too cool?
No, I think they just,
Too cool?
I would definitely wear a helmet.
No, it was just one of those things.
That day?
It was just one of those things we weren't really thinking about at the time. But
I mean, that could mess you up.
You could die.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, but yeah, so you get to pick up the foul balls and usually give them to a kid. And then you have people that are sitting next to you trying to bribe you. Like, hey, I'll pay you $100 if you give them.
How much are those balls worth?
Nothing. I don't
Nothing?
know. Yeah. I mean,
Did you ever give one away?
You give them away.
No,
all the
I
time.
mean like.
Oh, for money?
Yeah. I'll give you
Who is the
$100.
most
course
famous
not.
person on your team?
Who's on the Phillies?
Yeah.
Well, at the time, they had just won the World Series. So it was a huge year, and they made it to the World Series the first year I started. So everybody was a celebrity. I mean, Jimmy Rollins, Chase Utley, Cole Hamels, Ryan Howard.
Don't
Yeah,
know
they
any
had
of
a good
these
team.
names.
Of course you don't. They're legends in Philadelphia.
Legends.
It's crazy.
Perrin's also a legend.
Trying to wrap it up. I keep wanting to hear
No, we're
some more
done.
of these stories.
Yeah, we're good.
All right. Maybe next time.
Thanks.
Thanks, Perrin.
Thanks.